challenges and why the concept is worthy and vital to consider in the context of modern air warfare. I will then present the rise and fall of the concept from Baghdad to Kyiv through the frame of 8 factors I identify as critical to the conceptual development and direction of strategic air power, arranged into 4 development stages. I will illustrate these stages with some case study examples, relevant operations, and technological developments. I will then conclude with my theory of strategic air power development and what this implies for the future role of the concept in air warfare, reflecting on some key challenges and differences that I foresee in the future operating environment. So let me first start by defining strategic air power in the modern world. The concept isn't new. The idea that aircraft can be used to create strategic effects, those beyond the battlefield and directed towards the heart of the enemy, are as old as powered flight itself. Many early and influential thinkers and theorists, from Dewey and Tukhachevsky to Mitchell, Sherman, and Trenchard, wrote about and advocated for air power to be used in this way, often using highly destructive means and focusing on both counter-force and counter-value targets. World War II offered operations on all sides that illustrated both approaches, and nuclear weapons played a significant and enduring role in shaping and narrowing what strategic air power meant during the Cold War, particularly in light of the failure of conventional strategic bombing by the US Air Force in Vietnam's Rolling Thunder air campaign. The principles of modern strategic air power retain the basic idea of creating effects beyond the battlefield, but it also adds new principles to these. These are that air platforms themselves are not strategic, but how they are utilized and directed can be. That achieving strategic change with air power rests upon the objectives to be achieved, the targets selected, and the effects sought. That the unique attributes of air power, rapidity, mobility, flexibility, simultaneity, and the concentration of force at a specific place and time are central to delivering strategic effects, and that the aim is to use air power to deliberately and systematically disrupt, damage, paralyze, or destroy the enemy's system of political, economic, and military power, to the point that they are no longer able to fight effectively, and that by doing so, control is achieved, and with it, the conditions for ending the military aspects of conflict with a rapidity, directness, and lower cost in blood and treasure than is possible with surface forces alone. A few final considerations. For a state to achieve this, it must be viable. And for it to be viable, 2 things must be true. The first is capability. An entire ecosystem must be created that brings together intelligence collection, processing, and dissemination, strike through platforms, weapons, and their operators, and enabling capabilities, including command and control, aerial refueling, and planners. All elements are vital, and they must all act in concert. The second thing that must be true is intent. The attacking state must be seeking control through the use of air power, and this must be based upon conceiving the enemy as a system, understanding that system, and planning and directing air power against it. This may be reflected in its doctrine, in campaign plans, or through political signaling. So, let's now consider the foundations, the origins and rise of modern strategic air power. The foundation stage for strategic air power occurred in the final decades of the Cold War and lasted into the late 1990s. These foundations saw strategic air power's rise to prominence, and it became a core feature of modern air warfare through the Desert Storm air campaign against Iraq in 1991 and through its aftermath. Three factors were critical in shaping the concept's development. The first of these was air power's transformation through a combination of a reconceived battlefield and the role of new technology as an enabler. To unpack that a little, a great deal of this transformation occurred within and emerged from the United States Air Force, and specifically the extensive reform of tactical air command, which began in the years after the Vietnam War. The air power analyst Ben Lambeth called this period the renaissance of American air power, and it was. But its impacts went far beyond just America. That the origins of modern strategic air power can be traced back to tactical air command at first seems strange. Why not strategic air command? Strategic air command's role in Vietnam was marked by its general failure to destroy the Viet Cong or to defeat the North Vietnamese. And it was a doctrinal anomaly in an era of nuclear deterrence against the Soviet Union and its primary mission as a nuclear strike force. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, it reverted back to its nuclear role, a mission that required little innovation or change in approach. Tactical air command, on the other hand, had room for development. It had conducted some successful operations in Vietnam in close air support, and had taken part in the more strategic linebacker operations towards the end of the war. After the war, its focus returned to supporting the US Army in the European theatre. This required constant innovation to remain relevant and able to complete its assigned missions. This included adapting to the increasingly powerful threat from integrated air defenses, which threatened the close air support mission, and had been clearly seen in the 1973 war, for example. It included the incorporation of tactical air command into the air-land battle doctrine, in which it would seek to interdict Soviet forces behind the front lines using precision weapons, and the consequential shift in thinking and planning from the tactical level to the operational level as a result of the complexity of the modern battlefield. American air power generally and tactical air command specifically benefited from the parallel advances in computing, miniaturization, command and control, and precision weapons, as well as the rise to senior positions of tactical air command officers who had served in Vietnam. While strategic air command remained focused on the nuclear mission, tactical air command took up an increasingly strategic role on the conventional battlefield, a battlefield now framed by operational level thinking, strategic intent, and enabled by new technologies. The second development factor is directly related to these advances. Air power began to be reframed in national defense from a core strategic nuclear role and a supporting conventional role to aid ground forces into a core conventional capability for creating strategic effect in its own right. Achieving this required a new theoretical framework, and this emerged in both the United States and the Soviet Union in parallel, primarily as a result of thinking on how new technologies, and particularly computing and miniaturization, would affect military developments and the shift in thinking from tactical to operational planning that followed. In the United States, the theorists and Air Force officers John Boyd and John Warden were particularly influential to the transformation of tactical air command. Boyd lectured on the nexus of competition, warfighting, strategy, systems, and rapid adaptation. And Warden wrote the seminal work on the operational use of air power for strategic effect, the Air Campaign, which conceived the enemy as a system and advocated centers of gravity targeting against the critical elements. Later, Warden proposed the five rings theory of strategic attack to paralyze the enemy and prevent its action, and in which the enemy's leadership and command and control was at the center. This framework was also attractive to several US allies, Britain and Australia in particular, who saw it as a vehicle to transform their own air power into a more efficient, more powerful tool with greater utility. In parallel with theoretical developments in the United States, within the Soviet Union, senior officers were also making similar innovative theoretical leaps about the future of warfare the potential effects and utility of conventional air power, and the development of an operational level focus. This work was led by Marshal N.K. Ogakov, who wrote on the modern theatre operation, which theorized that conventional precision weapons could have operational and strategic effects well beyond the impact of tactical weapons, and with a greater utility than nuclear weapons. Ogakov and other proponents of conventional precision strike created a gap between Soviet frontal aviation and long-range nuclear strike, where air power could be used strategically. Reconnaissance strike complexes were the key element to fill this gap, through which ground and airborne, ISR, command and control, and precision weapons, both kinetic and electronic, would be combined and rapidly applied for strategic effect. Not only did these ideas break Soviet orthodoxy on the decisive nature of nuclear weapons and their supposedly unique ability to have strategic effect by suggesting that weapons other than ballistic missiles could be used to strike at depth, this thinking emerged in the mid-1980s and at a time of great change and upheaval in the Soviet Union, which was, in every conceivable way, unprepared and unable to adopt it. Consequently, strategic air power's theoretical framework was put into effect by the United States rather than the Soviet Union. The third factor, critical to the development of strategic air power, was a universal lesson taken from Desert Storm. This was that precision weapons would play a unique role in enabling strategic attack, strategic effects, and conventional deterrence in future, and that this, in turn, drove reforms across national air power. This lesson was linked to a broader understanding that air power would now be a central feature in future warfare, and the potential effects made possible by precision weapons. That this emerged from Desert Storm is notable, because there was little agreement amongst the advanced air power states as to exactly what the air campaign meant. Indeed, Desert Storm was interpreted quite differently by different states, and this interpretation was dependent upon their relationship with the United States and underlying structural factors concerning how their own air power was organized and what modern strategic air power meant in that context. A few examples. For the United States air power community, Desert Storm, the air campaign, was a confirmation of the post-Vietnam reform of tactical air command. It had been largely successful in achieving the political objectives sought against Iraq through the systems-based targeting methodology of Warden, which struck the air defenses, command and control, critical national infrastructure, and air force of Iraq quickly and efficiently, providing the American coalition with air superiority and creating disruption and damage that reduced the capability of the Iraqi army in Kuwait prior to the ground invasion. In contrast, in the Soviet Union, the air campaign sparked deep debate about its exact meaning and its implications. For some, it validated Ogakov and invalidated Soviet defense doctrine. For others, it was a limited example against a poor adversary that had no relevance to the Soviets' own defense capabilities. And for others, the underpinning approach to war fighting by the Americans was not compatible or attractive to Soviet strategic culture and the general staff system. Others saw it differently again. Israel accepted that the capabilities that the Americans used could be attractive and useful to it, but did not relate the air campaign to its own national defense, focused as it was on creating space for its own ground forces and deterrence against its neighbors. And in France, there was a basic philosophical disagreement with the American approach to warfighting, which directly offered little to change the role and focus of air power that had been established by the 1972 White Paper. But indirectly, the air campaign did show that in a changing post-Soviet world, change in its own air power would be eventually necessary. So, Desert Storm was not universally accepted, and the principles of modern strategic air power used by the United States not immediately adopted, but there was widespread acceptance that the potential, role, and effect of conventional air power had changed, and that other states, with expectations of influence through air power in the post-Cold War era, would be required to change as well. The first stage of strategic air power development had established it as a concept, a means of effecting strategic change through control, and the Desert Storm Air Campaign had, to a large degree, shown it to be credible, viable, and attractive to the most advanced air power states. The years after Desert Storm saw significant and wide-ranging reforms, new capabilities procured and put into development, and doctrinal change in Britain, France, Australia, Israel, and Russia. This included Britain's first independent air power doctrine in 20 years, and the return of a conventional strategic role for the Royal Air Force for the first time since the 1950s, through the publication of the first and second editions, respectively, of the AP 3000 doctrine, which itself adopted many of the ideas, the language, and the intent of US strategic air power. In Russia, basic reforms of the new and still highly fragmented Russian Air Force were undertaken, driven by Desert Storm, and, more persuasively perhaps, its own poor performance in the First Chechen War, which refuted the Iraq as an exception school of thought of the early 1990s and showed without doubt that post-Soviet air power wasn't fit for purpose. And in France, reforms were made that centralized command and control, consolidated some of the different functions of the Air Force, and a series of investments in new conventional air power capabilities were launched, including for Rafale, intelligence collection and command and control, in response to the 1994 White Paper, which offered clear direction on the expanded and extended role for conventional air power in post-Cold War Europe and beyond. These reforms and others were channeled and tested through the air campaigns of the 1990s and early 2000s, from Bosnia to Serbia and Chechnya to Afghanistan and back to Iraq. New doctrine, capabilities, and the aim to create strategic effects using air power were put into frequent practice, and by doing so, the direction of strategic air power was changed. The first of two critical factors for strategic air power's development that emerged during this time was the compression of the air power development cycle in response to operational experience and the consequent emergence of new and improved capabilities. This was driven by a combination of operations, which created a feedback loop for the analysis of successful and unsuccessful targeting, effects, and control, technology, which developed rapidly between 1995 and 2003, with the proliferation of increasingly powerful sensors, networks, computers, mission planning, software, intelligence collection, UAVs, data processing, dissemination, and command and control capabilities, and reforms to direct these advanced capabilities, particularly the rise of effects-based operations and planning, conceived by General David Deptula, a key figure in the planning and execution of Desert Storm, and which built upon the work of Boyd and Warden to fully utilize the huge US advantage in strike, intelligence, and enabling capabilities, and which put strategic effect at the heart of planning. The development of strategic air power was accelerated by frequent operations, but it was also taken in a particular direction. This direction was the second significant factor in strategic air power's development in this period. The revolutionary improvements made to sensor-to-shooter timescales and the consequences this had for targeting, control, and expectations. This was enabled by the previously noted technological progress, advances in intelligence gathering and processing, underlying air power reforms, and operational necessity. It would have huge and long-lasting consequences for strategic air power as a concept. Technology, reform, and political direction made tactical missions such as air support and interdiction more viable and able to react to changing conditions on the ground. It also greatly improved the potential for time-sensitive targeting that could apply deadly force directly against enemy leadership and other high-value personnel. This in turn created new options for strategic attack. It promised the potential for air power to deliver system paralysis through decapitation strikes. Essentially, a concentrated focus on the center of Warden's 5 rings of strategic attack, and a shift in strategic air power's emphasis to granular, reactive targeting. All of this was a far cry from the pre-planned, simultaneous nationwide strikes against all elements of the enemy's system of power previously envisaged. Instead, light footprint, counter-personnel attacks, closely monitored and directed by political leaders, would be possible and even desirable to achieve strategic effect and control of the adversary. The problem was, this didn't work. The third stage of strategic air power's development was marked by the limitations of the concept exposed through a combination of operational practice, theoretical challenge, and a broader divergence from its original intent and theoretical framing. The operational environment was a major element in this. Insurgency in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Second Intifada in the Palestinian territories, the Second Lebanon War, and the Russo-Georgia War all challenged national uses of air power and its use to create strategic effects. Different actors, non-state groups and networks, united by ideology and by religion, emerged that were not the traditional or intended focus of modern strategic air power theory or associated national air power doctrines, but against which air power and the intention to create strategic effects was directed through counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency operations that reshaped how strategic air power would be utilized. This created conceptual fractures, exposed limits and contradictions, and broadly contributed to the concept's fall. The previously discussed revolutionary improvements in sensor-to-shooter timescales and the options for targeting in strategic effect that emerged were perfectly suited to the demand for time-sensitive, counter-personnel, and high-value targeting required to combat terrorist groups and insurgents in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. But the counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency strategies at the heart of Allied operations in both of these countries emerged from outside of the air power community, with the Central Intelligence Agency and the US Army, respectively, which meant that the broader and deeper appreciation of strategic air power, and indeed air power itself, was lacking. The result was a disconnection between technological progress, operational expectations, and battlefield success. This was seen through the Allies' inability to quickly or effectively defeat the insurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq from the air, and also played out in Israel in its war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. In that case, Israel had reformed and repositioned its air power to draw upon elements of US strategic air power, a firepower-led approach to warfighting, and adopted an indigenous theoretical framework, systemic operational design, to employ it. This theory emphasized Israel's qualitative military edge and precision firepower capabilities to cause the systemic disintegration of its enemies, but this was a divergence from traditional Israeli doctrine. When it was employed against Hezbollah, it broadly failed, not least because it was new, untested, applied against a dispersed, adapted, non-state adversary, widely misunderstood within and beyond the Israel Defense Force, and set unrealistic expectations about what air power could deliver. The resultant critical factor for the development of strategic air power that emerged, and a confirmation of the beginning of its fall after the previous 2-decade-long rise, was the evident divergence of agreement in the concept's future direction. This was because of the tactically focused adaptation that had occurred through counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency, and high-value targeting operations, its relatively narrow application against leadership and counterforce targets, its limited achievements against diverse, predominantly non-state adversaries, and its slow progress against them despite overwhelming military and technological superiority. While success had largely driven conceptual convergence and agreement, failure, or at least its shortfalls, caused the opposite. Consequently, the broadly agreed strategic state-centric concept fragmented between two different approaches: an enhanced tactical role, which was dominant in practice, and a more hypothetical, future-focused strategic attack approach designed to deter state actors. This was much closer to the core idea of modern strategic air power, but it was not being used in practice. Operational practice in the mid to late 2000s and the conceptual divergence that emerged drove two further factors critical to strategic air power's development. First, states began to reposition strategic air power in national defense, based upon reflections of the expectations that had previously been placed upon it. The pace at which states did this, though, was determined by the conflicts that they were fighting, their duration, and their outcomes. For example, due to the limited timescales of Israel's and Russia's conflicts in this period, 34 days for the Second Lebanon War, 1 week for the Russo-Georgia War, failures and shortfalls occurred quickly and within clearly bound geographic and adversarial limits. Consequently, through a period of post-conflict evaluation, both Israel and Russia were able to identify the roots of air power's failures and pursue appropriate reforms. These refocused air power's strategic effects and were initially successful. In the longer term, though, they would fail. In contrast, during this period, the Allies were fighting long wars in which there was no operational end and in which the adversary and the political objectives guiding air power's use evolved. Although refinements and new capabilities were introduced, the extent to which substantive change could be made through evaluation was limited by ongoing practice, and consequently, strategic air power's role in national defense narrowed. The final factor that shaped the direction of strategic air power was the emergence of structural limits on the possible strategic effects that could be delivered in practice. This was driven by the normalization of certain methods and the context in which they were being applied. Simply put, states were increasingly trapped by the momentum of operations and their associated ways of operating, or forced into ever narrower applications of strategic effect because of the enemies that they were fighting. To unpack this factor and claim a little bit further, consider the strategic air campaigns conducted by the United States, Britain, and France during the 2010s. Operations Odyssey Dawn and Unified Protector against Libya in 2011, Operation Serval in Mali in 2013 and 2014, and Operation Inherent Resolve against Islamic State from 2014 to 2019. The first operation against Libya, Odyssey Dawn, was a classic use of strategic air power and led by the United States. It targeted Libyan air defences, airfields, command and control, and limited attacks on fielded forces to those that posed an immediate threat on the ground. This established air superiority and limited the options of the Libyan government and its armed forces. However, the second operation, Unified Protector, reverted to a model of operations more closely seen in the counterinsurgency operations employed in Afghanistan and Iraq in the previous decade, focusing on counterforce, time-sensitive targeting, small numbers of reactive sorties, close political monitoring and direction of operations, and the gradual application of air power, which only became more substantive and widespread and began to counter the Libyan system of power after the earlier phases had failed to change the situation on the ground. Operation Serval followed a similar approach, primarily directing air power against counterforce targets in a reactive manner, But given the advance of jihadist forces in Mali, this approach was essentially imposed upon France, given the operating environment and the objectives that it was seeking. But in Operation Inherent Resolve against Islamic State was a far more politicized, limited, and gradualist application of air power in the expectation of creating strategic effects on the ground. The result was a 5-year-long air campaign that largely mimicked the counterinsurgency strategy of the mid to late 2000s, rather than conceptualizing Islamic State as the proto-state that it was, understanding its system of power and striking at its critical elements. In short, Allied understanding and practice of strategic air power had become limited to what was politically palatable and operationally viable, essentially just attempts to change the cost-benefit calculation of the enemy to force a change in behavior. Disruption, paralysis, and destruction of the enemy's system of power was no longer a realistic possibility to pursue. Israel found itself in a similar position. After the Second Lebanon War, it had re-evaluated and narrowed its own use of air power for strategic effect. This reflected the post-Lebanon acceptance that within Israel's immediate environment, Gaza, the West Bank, and South Lebanon, low levels of political violence could not be prevented, only managed, and that more significant threats further afield in Syria and Iran needed to be addressed preemptively. A combination of air power and special operations aimed to uphold deterrence through the use of limited, decisive force in order to prevent full-scale war. Thus, Israel's use of air power for strategic effect was used to change its enemy's cost-benefit calculations. For example, Operation Outside the Box destroyed Syria's Al-Kabir nuclear facility, and Operation Cast Lead, a limited, focused campaign against Hamas, created organizational disruption sufficient to restore the status quo. At the time, strategic destruction was not a viable or desirable option for the Israeli government. But as Hamas adapted, shifting more of its operations underground, it began to thwart the strategic effects that Israel sought to create in later operations. The October 2023 attacks by Hamas changed Israel's calculations again. The narrow, cost-benefit focused strategic effect sought had evidently failed, and air power was redirected towards strategic destruction to achieve the control of Hamas now deemed critical. Finally, a word on Russian strategic air power and its position in the fall of the concept. In the post-conflict analysis of the Russo-Georgia War, significant reform of the armed forces was undertaken. The New Look reforms aimed to reduce, professionalize, and modernize the military, and for Russian air power, this included new advanced variants of its strike aircraft, new avionics, communication systems, and weapons, and a general shift towards a more advanced, strategically capable air power in line with the theorized reconnaissance strikes complexes. The use of air power would be guided by a new national security strategy, which emphasized a whole-of-state approach, with overlapping, complementary areas of military and non-military power, all aimed at deterring the West. The theoretical framework for this would be new type warfare, which would utilize Russian air power at the high end as the high-end direct arm of Russian power in combination with low-end, hidden, and non-military elements. The remaining disparate elements of the Russian Air Force were combined into a unified Russian Aerospace Forces, the VKS, and applied when opportunity arose. And arose it did in Syria, which became the test case for the newly reformed, strategically more capable VKS. Here, air power could be used for demonstrable strategic effect, securing Russia's position in the Middle East, preserving its Syrian ally and its own access to Syrian bases on the Mediterranean, confirming its great power status at home and abroad, and utilizing the very best of Russian strike aircraft, Su-34s, Tu-22Ms, Tu-160s, cruise missiles, including the KH-555 and the KH-101, new UAVs, and the GLONASS satellite system. The destructive strategic effects created and sought by Russian air power were then exploited on the ground by local forces, which included Iranian proxies and the Syrian army. Although Syria could be classed as a successful employment of strategic air power for Russia, its lessons of its shortfalls and failings, particularly in ISR, command and control, and response times to enemy movement, were not well learned, and its successes against a relatively weak enemy in a permissive operating environment put it in a poor position to launch a larger scale air campaign against its neighbour Ukraine in 2022. Russia's use of air power against Ukraine at the start of the war underlined its own structural limitations, restricted to the pursuit of strategic destruction only, and also its broader limitations and its failure to fully understand that the relative success enjoyed in Syria could not simply be replicated and repeated against Kyiv. Critically, for Russia, the VKS has not been able to conduct significant mass attacks using large numbers of strike aircraft arrayed against multiple targets simultaneously or at depth. It has not been able to successfully destroy or disrupt enough of Ukraine's air defenses and command and control, and its ability to conduct suppression and defeat of enemy air defenses has been found wanting. It cannot use precision weapons in sufficiently high numbers and against strategically important targets, and consequently, it has not been able to establish air superiority, which is critical to both ground operations and any meaningful attempt to create strategic effects from the air. And now to assess strategic air power's role in future warfare, the previous three stages of concept development, foundation, the pivot and change, and the limitations, show the arc of strategic air power's rise and fall in the post-Cold War era, from Desert Storm and a unified single idea to a fragmented, limited idea and the battlefields of Ukraine. But a fourth stage of development suggests that this fall is not necessarily the end of the concept. Indeed, long before the 2020s, the beginnings of conceptual renewal were evident. And through this renewal, the possibility for strategic air power's future direction can be considered. The idea of renewal arises from the limits, the shortfalls, and the failures of the concept, and the structural constraints imposed by a combination of practice, politics, and adversary adaptation. Renewal aims to address shortfalls in creating strategic effect in contemporary and future operations, to mitigate conceptual and operational complexity, and to increase utility, and to position air power for a future operating environment and the challenges posed by new technologies and by peer competitors. The means to do this began over a decade ago, with research and development programs to develop next generation systems, platforms, weapons, sensors, and communications, which will all leverage increasingly powerful means of connecting, maneuvering, and reacting, permitting more complex, more rapid, more survivable, and more advantageous options for those states that can perfect them. These include a new generation of stealth platforms, chief amongst them the B-21 Raider, extended range cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles and propulsion, new strike and intelligence collecting UAVs, and investment by the military in artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, and the combat cloud to connect, process, analyze, disseminate, exploit, and coordinate data on the future battlefield. New theoretical frameworks, akin to the operation-based thinking that transformed late Cold War air power, will be required to draw all of these elements together into a coherent whole, supported by new doctrine and new training. Collectively, new means of creating strategic effect will emerge, and these in turn will be shaped by the adversaries to be controlled and the environments in which to do it. In effect, a new foundation of strategic air power will have been created, and the cycle of its conceptual development will begin again. I'd like to finish this evening by very briefly highlighting some of the challenges that this future strategic air power will face, because these are quite different to what has come before. First, the adversary will be state peer competitors with advanced air power, air defences, and the means to deny access. Air superiority may be impossible, and temporary superiority created only by long-range stealth platforms, long-range hypersonic missiles and glide bombs, and electronic warfare. Most states will not be able to achieve this, blunting any potential strategic effects that could have followed. Second, uncrewed air platforms, combat drones, and loyal wingmen will add much-needed mass to strike operations and potentially be expendable or even intentionally destructive themselves. This will both aid the generation of strategic effect, but may well thwart it as well. Third, the deterrent effect of strategic air power, as well as its operational utility, will diminish in the face of nuclear states. Attacking the critical elements of a nuclear state system of power will almost inevitably invite nuclear retaliation. Fourth, and finally, as I'm now short on time, strategic air power will need to contend with and be integrated into the full spectrum of warfare, which will now include cyber, electromagnetic, and the space domains. So, a challenging future awaits strategic air power. My thanks for your attention this evening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very dearly for your presentation. As maybe in the room, any questions? So I have some questions for you. Do you hear me correctly?
I can hear you.
Great. So my first question is regarding the relationship between nuclear deterrence and strategic air power. I know that in your first chapter you talk about it a lot regarding the development of the theory of strategic air power, and regarding the challenges. You talked about the diminishing role of strategic air power for nuclear states. Could you care to elaborate the relationship and its evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose if we go back to its original influence, so obviously strategic air power, as initially conceived and used right up till the end of the Second World War, was conventionally focused. Nuclear weapons change radically what strategic air power is in the aftermath of the Second World War. And as we saw with Strategic Air Command in the United States, this becomes its entire rationale and reason to deliver nuclear weapons to their targets as part of, in the case of the Americans and the Soviets, the nuclear triad. This very much shapes thinking. Arguably it constrains thinking about what strategic then means in the context of air power. It simply means the nuclear mission. Strategic effects are nuclear effect. The two are absolutely entwined. And therefore conventional air power is restricted to those non-strategic roles, which we talked about a little as well, such as close air support. It's only later, as I talked about, when interdiction and the sort of deeper strike becomes necessary in the European theatre, that thinking can even change around this, and it's not universally accepted, and it's not particularly well received in many quarters, because it breaks an orthodoxy which has then existed for sort of 50 years about what strategic air power is in relation to nuclear weapons. I think that in some respects, as we enter a new era, I think, of strategic air power, where it has to be ranged against, from the American perspective, they'll obviously be thinking about it in the context of China, and to a certain extent Russia, and no doubt that the British, the French, will be thinking about it in the context of Russia in particular. The question has to be asked as to whether the fundamental ideas central to strategic air power, whether that's Warden's 5 rings, the effects-based operation ideas of Deployer, and the various doctrines around strategic attack and deep strike that exist in all of these countries, whether or not they can be credible against a nuclear weapons state. The Russians amended their own nuclear use doctrine in the early 2010s to include massed conventional strikes as a reason for a nuclear response. One assumes that since then they haven't relaxed that, and are probably quite likely to have only raised lowered the threshold, at which point they would use nuclear weapons. So there's a real question as to whether or not this is a realistic deterrent going forward against Russia and China. But of course, that's not necessarily the only two states that it can be aimed at. One can certainly conceive that the use of conventional strategic air power by Israel against Iran, for example, would be a highly credible deterrent and a highly credible threat in its own right, and would likely be highly destructive and highly problematic for the Iranians themselves should it ever be used. So I would say that would remain credible. But I think in the context of China, it would be unrealistic to assume that conventional strikes against the Chinese mainland beyond an extremely limited scenario around Taiwan would perhaps be credible.
I have another question, and so in the conclusion of your thesis, you implied the beginning of a new cycle of strategic air power development, especially regarding new technology. So you talked about it a lot, like machine learning, big data, etc. Could you maybe elaborate and explain the broader baseline regarding the theoretical framework that allows us today to expand on strategic air power?
I got most of that. So was that to explain the sort of the baseline sort of concept of strategic air power? Was that the question?
Sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, you break up a little bit. So could you just repeat the question?
Yes. So we could like we regard the evolution of air power regarding new technology, but rather was the advancement of the theoretical framework. We had the EDOs of David Tula, the 5 rings of Warden, Boyd, and what about new theoretical framework?
Yes. Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And actually, an observation I sort of made doing this research was that there is this, there's a real high point of sort of theoretical framework development in the 1980s, especially, and to a certain extent into the 1990s. It starts to really tail off after that. There is a bit of debate in the 2000s, particularly amongst British, American, and French officers. There's a lot of activity in the journals, essentially critiquing some of those earlier theoretical frameworks, adding to them in places, but largely sort of expanding upon them or trying to mitigate some of the problems that are seen within them. Shimon Never's work in Israel in the 2000s to develop systemic operational design is perhaps a slightly more recent example of a theoretical framework, although that was very much a casualty of the Lebanon War. And we've already talked around effects-based operations and Deptula's work. I think there has to be a new theoretical framing because of although the ultimate aims of strategic air power will remain the same, the means by which that occurs is going to have to change. It's going to have to change because of enormous technological progress, but also because of when and where it's going to be used, not against sort of medium power states like Iraq was back in 1991, but as potentially a feature of a European war, potentially as a feature of a war over Taiwan or on the Korean Peninsula, for example. So it must integrate all of these new technologies, and it must account for the extraordinarily rapid potential for warfare to be conducted in the future. And of course, we're talking there about things like the cyber domain, and of course the space domain, the dissemination of enormous amounts of data, the ability to process that, the ability to turn that into something usable, but ultimately to start automating that as well, to actually take that out of the hands of the users, and to start essentially adding in a degree of automation into the process of things like target selection and campaign planning. Even back in 1991, the extraordinary level of effort required to build the campaign plan had started to have an effect quite quickly, particularly once you've moved through all of your pre-planned targets and that you're looking at things like bomb damage assessments, you're looking at the satellite images, you're looking at on the ground intelligence about what's been hit, the effects that that's having, and having to then replan the campaign based on that feedback loop. And again, that was certainly a feature of the Operation Iraqi Freedom as well, and the US air campaign there. That is only going to get more difficult in the future, and therefore it would seem essential for a new theoretical framework to exist, or at least a fairly substantial amendment to what currently exists. The question perhaps is, well, yeah, there's going to be an impact on how well placed air forces are to start thinking about this. And I only say that because obviously throughout the 2000s, throughout the 2010s in the West, we largely haven't fought the kind of wars that require that sort of thinking, and very much a large thrust of what I talked about this evening is that limitation and that narrowing and that redirection of strategic effect into a more sort of tactical sort of guise. So the question is, it's going to take a sort of fairly hefty leap in sort of in theory to get back to where it needs to be, and to be able to incorporate all of those new technologies and ways of operating in the future.
Thank you. And so, like to go on this question, we thought about the United States, France, Britain, Israel, Australia, and Russia. But regarding peer-to-peer conflict, especially in Taiwan, is there, and I know it's not in your thesis, but you surely know something about that, about Chinese strategic bombing thinking, and especially maybe destruction warfare and confrontation of the US war fighting methods.
Yeah, so as you note, my research didn't cover China for two. I'll explain why. For two reasons. One was I selected my cases based on operational use, so use in practice in multiple conflicts over my research period, and of course, China has not fought a war since its war with Vietnam in 1979, so there was essentially no evidence in that instance. Also, the Chinese air power was arguably nowhere close to advanced in 1990, nowhere near where it is today. And I will hold my hands up and say I'm not an expert on Chinese air power. I have some thoughts though. My thoughts are these. One is that as it is untested, that is going to be probably one of the most important things to consider. It's very easy to look at equipment. It's very easy to look at numbers. It's very easy to listen to rhetoric. And I think anybody who absorbed what Russia was saying in the run-up to the 2022 invasion very much would have expected Russian air power, and indeed the whole Russian military, to perform in quite a different way to what it did on the ground. So I think that's a word of caution. However, the Chinese will, of course, be learning enormous lessons from the war in Ukraine, and it will be applying those. It will be thinking about what the Russians have done wrong, not least because they do share a reasonable amount of equipment, and certainly, or if not today, certainly in origin. But it'll also be looking at what the Americans have done and what the Ukrainians are able to do, and very much be able to sort of transplant that onto Taiwan. I think other things to consider is that how China would potentially fight that war, and that can very much be divided between what it would do to Taiwan and what it would need to do before it could do anything to Taiwan. And of course, this is where we have you'll be familiar with the anti-access area denial idea, the pushing the Americans out to the first and second island chains, some degree of preemptive strikes on US forces in the region, and essentially ensuring that the area, around Taiwan, indeed that entire part of Asia, becomes hostile to to American and other allied forces, and very much playing to its own advantage there, because of course it is essentially the home team, so to speak. It is the Chinese mainland is close by, the American mainland is not. America will be operating from Japanese bases, Guam, potentially the Philippines, Korea in theory, and from carriers, all of which present vulnerabilities, of course. So I suppose to bring it back to strategic air power, I don't think China is going to be attacking any of the absolutely kind of core critical elements of the American system of power in an attack on Taiwan, but it is clearly going to have to carry out some very substantial counter force activity at range. I think it's more likely to use its ballistic missiles for this than its air force. I could be wrong, but in a way that would present the least amount of threat to China's own air power, which could then be used for things like air defense and the actual attack on Taiwan, which I think would be a far more strategic strike, far more likely to employ the kind of classical features of strategic air power that we've discussed tonight in terms of attacks on command and control, leadership, the airfields of Taiwan, its critical national infrastructure. Even the threat of that is likely to be a powerful thing. But whether it actually goes through with it, then that would be obviously devastating to Taiwan. I think the other thing to just sort of consider in all of this is that, and again, we probably have to go back more to the Gulf War, is that there will obviously be a significant ground invasion, albeit an amphibious ground invasion that would follow. So this is going to be a combined arms operation. This is not going to be air power acting alone or the missile forces acting alone by any means. This is essentially a full military effort as and when it comes.
Thank you. And maybe last question, if you don't mind. So returning to Russian air power, and especially to the war in Ukraine, the limitation of Russian air power, you talked about it in your tense on warfare, the new type of warfare, and in the implementation of the ideas of Bulgakov in the 1980s. But what about their reactualization for the conflicts in Ukraine by the Russian command? How could it have been helped Russian staff to maybe help more?
So you're asking essentially, with that deep background and deep understanding of what strategic air power should be, essentially why wasn't it applied in that manner, and what could they have learned? It's actually I think a recurring theme in Russian air power. The theory and the practice are divergent almost at all times. Some of this will be down to I think sort of Russian Soviet strategic culture and the place of air power within the military. which has always played a subordinate role to the ground forces. That is, of course, traceable right back to, communist doctrine around the role of, sort of massed ground forces versus the Navy versus the Air Force. The Air Force is there for close air support only, and a very limited kind of sort of nuclear role as well. So I think there's almost a sort of inherent sort of resistance to employing air power, or suggesting that air power could kind of play this role and actually have strategic effect. But arguably, the successes that they saw in the Second Chechen War and the amount of destruction that they were able to inflict, which did have a strategic effect alongside artillery, plus the sort of failure of the Air Force in the Georgian War, it performed poorly, did give them that kind of motivation to then reform quite substantially, to invest quite substantially. My view is that the war then in Syria, the intervention in Syria, gave them a really poor readout as to what they were capable of. I think they saw the effects there. I think they saw the kind of collaboration between the Air Force and the local ground forces. They saw that ultimately the objectives they set themselves could be achieved. Reasonably low footprint, reasonably low cost, reasonably low casualty rate, very few aircraft losses. And ultimately, they achieved something which they very much wanted to achieve, and was extremely helpful to Putin in sort of representing Russia to the world. In so many ways, this parallels perhaps some of the lessons that the Americans and the British drew from operations in the late 90s to then inform what goes on in the 2000s. But so I think in the preparation for Ukraine, they had mismatched expectations between what they did in Syria and what they could potentially do in Ukraine. I think other elements to consider are that it was a combined arms attack. They were going for clearly a sort of a highly maneuverable drive to Kyiv with air power clearing the way. And this was all going to be over supposedly pretty fast. So the question also is, how much of an air campaign did they even plan beyond the first few days? I'm guessing probably not a tremendous amount of thought perhaps went into that in the long run. They certainly wouldn't have been expecting to still be employing the Air Force in Ukraine 2 years later. And I think also the assumptions that I think many analysts have pointed out that Russia was making about Ukraine probably also gave them a false impression of what their air power could do. I suppose in total this means that they didn't think they needed to do a full strategic air campaign to take the ideas of Ogakov, which would have, if properly implemented, would have had a significantly different effect to the one that they were able to achieve. My interpretation is I don't think they thought they needed it. I don't think they and I think that they thought they could do it with far fewer aircraft, far fewer weapons, far less effort, and do it quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Warren. I think we'll be ending this session today. We thank you all, and I hope you have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you. Goodbye.